Welcome to this podcast is making me thirsty, the number one destination for Seinfeld fans. This episode 74. Today's guest has over 25 years of Show Biz experience as a comedian, writer, producer, and director. He's the chief creative officer for Sweetwood Creative production company. He's appeared on The Tonight Show with Johnny Carson, and his one-man show, The Wonder Bread Years, aired on PBS to critical acclaim. He has his own podcast, popular podcast called Creativity in Captivity. He was part of the original writing staff on Seinfeld for season 1, appeared in 2 Seinfeld episodes, and was a warm-up act for Seinfeld live tapings. We were super excited he took the time to join us. Please welcome Pat Hazell. Pat, thanks for joining.
You're welcome. You've almost run out of gas once you get to me. Like the second cousin twice removed from the Seinfeld family.
Season 1, man. That's it. You and Matt Gorman.
Well, listen, not many people were there from the beginning, and you were. So take us back, 1990. I know you had the relationship with Matt Gorman. Tell us how the whole Seinfeld experience came about. I know you wrote the play Bunk Bread Brothers, but tell us how you caught the eye of Larry and Jerry.
Well, that play Bunk Bed Brothers was our spec script, which was kind of a little bit different than most people would send in another sitcom or something. And Matt and I had written that as a showcase for our own, dreams of a sitcom or something. So we really just got lucky that got delivered at Castle Rock right when they were looking for folks. I had a bit of a relationship with Jerry prior, which was that I opened for him on his first HBO special called Stand Up Confidential. And I was kind of tooled around the country on occasion being an opening act on the road. And somewhere along the line, Jerry used to joke that I was protected under the Seinfeld umbrella of insurance, that if I could keep coming up with funny things, that I'd have stuff to do. And when I submitted that script along with Matt, Larry and Jerry were doing it by themselves. They had done the pilot all alone, and then we're looking for some folks, but they had a short order. And you guys are the experts on all this more than even I am. It was called the Seinfeld Chronicles at that time. Mm-hmm. And it was done under the late night and specials division of NBC, which was not the traditional primetime path. And they gave them a run at these 4 episodes. So Matt and I really picked up the first 2 slots to join them. And we wrote an episode that I think was only the title made it through the cut. It's called The Platonic Bomb, which was introducing Julie Louis-Dreyfus's character. Elaine was not in the pilot, as you know. Right. And so we kind of got dished out this idea to introduce the girl. And, in retrospect, you look back at all of this, it was so clear in a way to Larry David what he was up to, but Matt and I were new on the scene. And so we did write an episode, and they looked at it, and then Larry took it home and did a nice job of completely rewriting it. And because what you understand, the more you're in the business, is that the creators and the showrunners know the voice of the show. So even though you think you're writing funny stories or funny jokes, it's not sort of the whole shebang. And they still probably didn't know what it was completely at that time, but the voice of what it intended to be was rested with Larry and Jerry.
Right. And so as I guess, not having a credit for actually writing an episode, as a special consultant, I guess is sort of was your role in a way. Like take us through a typical week, I guess what I'm asking. Like how involved, I know it sounds like you pitched ideas. Where you got, like, how did it typically go? Did Larry and Jerry already have those 4 from season 1 sort of written, and you guys kind of bounced off ideas and punched them up or anything like that? I mean, just sort of what was your typical week like, I guess?
Well, at the time I had a few different responsibilities, but one of them at the time was that they were doing more interstitial stand-up. So I was contributing to those club things with Jerry, which meant also sometimes testing the stuff or prepping that stuff up. And we were all involved in sort of looking back at it, or it wasn't a traditional roundtable, which it became when there was a bigger staff. But, Larry and Jerry had a fairly good sense of of the main characters. We were there though when we had to name the coffee shop Monks, and when we had to come up with the theme song with Jonathan Wolf, and that was where the real learning curve was to be a part of all of the nuances of what it was going to be, and keeping Kramer's name. Kramer, was a real guy, and everybody knows that by now. But at the time, NBC didn't want us to use it. They were very, adamant about, we don't want to use a real guy's name. And Larry goes, yeah, it'll be fine. And they go, no, we can't do that. And I said, why don't we get the rights? Like, why don't we call him? And Larry went in the other room and called this guy, Kenny Kramer, and offered him $1,000. And he came back, he goes, he wants 2,000. And it was classic Kramer, right? And the network says no. And I just said, what are you talking about? It's done. Like, that's the end of the negotiation. $2,000. We don't have to horse around with this guy's name. And they tried Kessler. They tried a few other things to try to push on us, but it was the perfect name. And we, in those several episodes in the beginning, it sort of grew on us where it was unchangeable at that point. And the coffee shop was a little more complex because in New York, if you named something, whatever crazy name you gave it, if there was one like that, you could get sued by the restaurant. They would think it was that restaurant. Right. So I don't know how many different diner names and things. We tried dozens and then almost hundreds of names. You couldn't really do Bob's. You couldn't do whatever because there was going to be one in the state of New York, if not in the city. So we had run out of even crazy names that wouldn't get cleared by the network. And there was a Thelonious Monk poster in that office. I don't know. It was just in the Castle Rock office. And I think out of exhaustion, I don't remember if it was Jerry or Larry said, just try Monks. And then they go, yep, that's good. It's clear. Right. And we're like, but at that time we didn't care anymore. We weren't, like we got one
connection, the Thelonious Monk connection. I like it. And
Pat, you and Matt were young guys, right? At what, late 20s when this all came out? So just tell us a little bit like how you connected with, we spoke with Matt Gorman. He was fantastic, but how did you guys originally connect? Obviously there's a special bond there.
Matt and I?
Yeah.
Well, I have to say that play Bunk Bed Brothers that we wrote was not a spec script we wrote to get this job. There was another guy who you may know of, Joel Hodgson. Joel was a Minnesota guy that knew Matt, and he created the Mystery Science Theater 3000 or whatever that video, movies thing was. And there was a club or a theater, kind of a hybrid. What it really was a converted Texaco. And they turned it into like an improv theater. And they had contacted me and Matt independently to see if we could create shows. And that was because Joel had created a show within that. And he recommended some people. So I remember us meeting at a party in LA through mutual friends. And he said, oh, you're right. Are you writing a thing? I go, well, I haven't started yet, but they've asked me to. And he said, they asked me to too. And I was like, why don't we just do it together? Like, it was such a move to downsize the amount of work we had to do, was for both of us to like lay half the work off on another guy, essentially. So rather than us writing two independent one-man shows or something, we sort of decided we have enough. Both of us had a lot of brothers, and we were going to make fun of brotherhood and sibling rivalry in a way that we could get away with it. Because if my brothers called me on it, I would say, no, that's about Matt's family, and then vice versa. But we could be really true about it. And so we had that. We were working on that. In the meantime, Matt was working on a few other kind of crazy ancillary things that were young writer related things. And like, I can't remember the name of the project, but for some reason he was working with Larry Hovis from the Hogan's Heroes days, who played, what was his character name? Anyway, the fact is that Larry Hovis suddenly had General Bull Carter and all these people that we grew up with on TV coming over to Matt's office. So I was always like, if somebody from Hogan's Heroes comes in there, call me. I want to meet him. Oh, he was Carter. He played the part of Carter. I don't know if you guys ever watched Hogan's Heroes, but
Sergeant Carter. Yeah.
That was the most unlikely sitcom about a prisoner of war camp.
Right. They had odd scenarios on sitcoms back in the day.
Well, in that one, they would craft German blankets into uniforms and then go into town to the Hofbrauhaus and go out with women and then come back to the camp. Right? It made no sense at all.
So we know that, your background in stand-up, you're opening for Jerry, and, we watched the Carson clip, and your stand-up is Seinfeld-esque, I thought, in a way, the raisin guy bit, the Halloween bit. So, in the first season, you mentioned you were a part of those stand-up bits that Jerry would do on the show. They were more prominent in the first season, and then they weeded them out eventually. The first season, there was a middle act too, the beginning, middle, and end. And they always had to tie into the show. That was kind of the idea of the show. Maybe take us through how it's interesting. I didn't realize that you had as much to do with that. It sounds like that was part of, one of your main responsibilities. Did you, were you writing for Jerry, or were you just kind of punching him up? Or you kind of just going over his stuff?
Jerry's such a good writer. He's a guy that, even today he writes most of his own stuff. At that time, it was about volume and getting there. And
right.
I had contributed a few things, tags and ideas, kind of just on the fly at clubs. And he liked me. And he, at the time, I had a magic and juggling act, juggling top hats and doing stuff. But when he took me on the road, he gave me some advice and just said, "Hey, why don't you leave the props at home, bring a suit bag, and you can you won't get fired. We'll go to Dallas and you can try just doing straight stand up." And I contend that I thought he was being a great mentor and very avuncular, but I think I came to realize that he didn't want to wait for my props, and it would be easier if we just got off the plane and hit the stage, sort of thing. But I did talk to him the other day on my podcast, and he said that it was a really, really a gift to not only be able to warm up his crowd, do stand up for that, but also to be around a guy that writes so much, writes so frequently. So when you contribute a notion or an idea or a tag, all of the work is done. You're putting the cherry on top of the whipped cream at that point. But I became a mechanic in his shop for a period of time. And so therefore you try always to look for things that you can do to enhance it, whether it's a visual thing. I used to contribute kind of crazy inventions for Kramer. He had, I don't even know what episode it in, but he had a necktie.
Yeah. Necktie dispenser. Yeah.
Yeah. So
that was you,
if a businessman stained his tie, he would tear it off and pull a new one out of the knot. Like, I came up with that kind of stuff all the time, and they would just laugh at the office, and they'd just find a way to wedge it in.
Right.
And I think I named Kramer's company, which was Kramerica Industries. And it was I wasn't even there anymore when Jerry called me and said, "Hey, can we keep using Kramerica Industries?" He's like, I go, "Of course." Like, what am I going to, I'm no use for it. But it was a kind of a courtesy call.
Right. That's awesome.
And it was tight back then. Like Jason and Julia and Michael, everybody was sort of building this like an Amish barn, right? Together in a way, coming up and not looking like traditional television. In that sitcom time, the family was the centerpiece. In those Family Ties days and the Cosby days and so forth, that was always a nuclear family, parents and kids. And I feel like Jerry came along of his time to be the first person that your friends were your family. And you began to see a lot more of that. You saw it on Ellen and Friends and Single Guy and all those other shows that they just sort of dispensed of. The parents would show up as secondary characters, but it really became about really what was happening in culture at the same time.
So Pat, you were there from the beginning. So what was your run? I know you had they brought you back. You did the pilot intro in season 4, but you were on staff, 90 and 91 or just 90?
Yeah, I really, to be honest, as a writer, which this is not a big reveal, but a special consultant is not a Writers Guild credit. And so therefore, they're not obligated to make the same kind. That's why, like, when there's books written about it and stuff, my name doesn't show up is because it wasn't mandated, right? If you had a story editor credit, if you had, and I didn't know, I was so young, I didn't know. I was just happy to be on the boat, right? Going to the new world. But I feel like when they did the first episodes, this drawing, the short straw came up to be the warm-up comedian among the writers. And I was naive amongst other things. We all thought, well, what do we need a funny comedian? We're all funny. Larry's funny. Jerry's funny. Matt's funny. And so we drew straws. That was Larry's insistence that short straw warms up the crowd. Oh, wow. So this was not on the pilot. It was on the first episode after the pilot when Julia Louis-Dreyfus had joined. So I drew the short straw and I did double duty for a few bucks to be the warm-up comedian. Huh. And then the second episode after that, I said, all right, we got to draw straws. And Larry goes, no, you have seniority. Like, you have the experience. So you have to go back. Now
it's your job. Yeah.
I sort of took that on and they paid me for it, but it was a really unusual, not a great job.
Is that why Larry brought you back in season 4 to do the warm up of the fake pilot?
I was still, here's the thing. After I was writing for the show, when I was writing on other things, I would come back one day a week and I would still do the warm up on tape night. So wow. I might have done 75 episodes that way, which is literally just keep when the show is going between each scene. I'm introducing the character actors. I'm answering questions from the crowd, doing, they ask the craziest questions. And I used to be very forgiving. I would say there's no bad questions. And, I'll get the answer if I have to talk to somebody on the boom mic or whatever I have to do. And then the questions got to be like, is this a repeat? I go, we're shooting the stupid thing right now. Like, I would just get,
it takes patience. You're dealing with that's a tough gig.
Tourists and people on work release program and wherever they get these audiences from. It was crazy. And we used to recreate scenes for the live audience if it connected it. I always said it's better to play the story out in order for the tape audience, because otherwise they don't understand the story and they're not laughing. So if let's say we pre-shot something in a car, that sequence might be, on a green screen or on the street scene or something, the studio audience wouldn't see that. So we'd bring out a couple of chairs and the actors that were in the car would sit and they would just act it out so that those lines would be there. So when we did the next scene, you knew what had just happened. And people afterwards would raise their hand. Now, how do they put the car around them and the scenery in? I go, it's like, no, we're not. Oh.
So you were there quite a while then, I think. But just to go back to the beginning, Jerry always talks about it. It's a homemade show. So it's pretty much you, Larry, Jerry, Matt. Did you guys go out to lunch a lot and kind of just talk about ideas? That's
where it happened. Like in the very beginning, it was difficult to write in an office. All of us had generally written in our homes and on airplanes and late at night and things. And there wasn't a lot of sitcom writing experience. Larry had done Fridays, I think, and a season maybe on Saturday Night Live. He had experience in the business, but not necessarily in this scripted form. I don't think Jerry had ever written on a sitcom. He had appearances on Benson much earlier that were, didn't last so long.
Right.
But so one of the things that was great is that they decided that we should write towards ourselves as the audience, that we shouldn't try to be derivative of Murphy Brown and things that were out at that time, because that was like having one oar out of the water. We're already going to be going the wrong direction if we don't. The hope, I think, for Jerry particularly was entertain ourselves and hope there's people like us that want to watch a show like this.
Right.
And so he was pretty focused on, there was a lot more observational humor. There was a lot more nuances over small things. Larry was great at making small things into big things. So in those early episodes about the jacket and things like that, the network was not a fan of something like a favorite jacket. They're like, that's nothing what's the point of that? Right. And I remember there being, some squabble about it, but ultimately, if anybody wants to learn something about story writing, you can make anything important to somebody. So it being favorite, it being your dad's, it being something that you got in some unusual way, that as a MacGuffin, that can be a pot of gold. It can be, a vial of cocaine. It can be whatever, right? To that person, you can make it matter. So I don't think the network was right. And I think Larry was, famously stubborn. And, if you watch Curb Your Enthusiasm, you see the real Larry David in many ways, which is that he just goes bullheaded into certain things. And he did that with some episode. That's how we started having 1 hour episodes, was he just refused to cut them down. He would just say to the network, nah, I think we'll just go longer. Well, how about if we double down on this one?
Yeah, it's interesting because when we talked to Matt Gorman, he mentioned he was in a meeting with Jerry and the NBC exec, and they were kind of giving him. Jerry pitched an idea, and they were like, "Nah, you should do this." And Jerry's like, "We're going to do this, or I'm leaving. Like, I don't care. I'll be a stand-up comedian." Kind of stuck to his guns. And Matt had mentioned how that kind of inspired him in a way. I mean, he was young at the time, and it sounds like you were too. I mean, what was it like being around Larry and Jerry? They had a vision, right? They stuck to it, like you said. Was there a lot of, what did you? You went on to your own career that's successful. I mean, writing your one-man show and things like that. I mean, that takes a lot. Did you learn? I mean, what did you learn from just being around them? Like you said, you were just there, you were on the boat. Like, anything you took away from just
there were lots of lessons along the way throughout, from just being in the sidecar of success, because it's their decision to make, but you can see whether it's right or wrong, or if it works for you and that sort of thing. I know that one of the things I learned early on is you can write TV or watch TV. You can't do both. At that time, it was sort of, I got a deadline, and I don't really want to write things like are on other shows. So I kind of want to tune that out a little bit. When Matt and I took the Bunk Bed Brothers, it was also optioned later by NBC under a show what we called American Pie prior to the movies and so forth. And I remember every episode Matt and I wrote of that, there was always a threat that they would cancel us. They do a table reading. They go, we're going to pull the plug. We go, well, you've already paid for it. Like, let us rehearse it. And then let us shoot it. You got to pay for it. Like, it's like, if it doesn't stink yet, we just read it at a table. So give us a chance to rewrite it and so forth. So we got frustrated enough that I called Jerry and I said, Jerry, I don't understand this, that they're always, like, the guillotine's going to drop every day that we're working. And he goes, well, that's when he said, you can be the captain of your own ship was the key. If the ship sails, if it sinks, you can be proud of it. If you board somebody else's ship and it goes down, you feel helpless and you go, those dudes didn't know how to sail, right? Which is, you're in a different business than network executives. Like, I'm not down on a network or studio. There's a relationship that's required. But at that time, you had a different game plan. Let's call the writers and stuff in the art business, right? It's theater. You're telling a story, you're storytellers. So you're trying to entertain people. And at the network, they are in the advertising business.
Right.
They sell Wheaties and Nikes, and it's they give away the show for free in between these commercials that make all their revenue, and that's what they care about. Right. So if Nike doesn't want to buy a spot in this because it doesn't appeal to them, you've got to change it. Which it's very easy to see when you look at the Super Bowl or American Idol's final episode. That's when all the eyes are there. That's when the big money, that's when it costs a lot for a Budweiser commercial, right? But in a smaller version, that's why they even take a break, is so they can make money. And so the idea that you have to write endings to scenes that are interesting enough to come back after a commercial and hold on to them, that model is all about revenue share, making revenue. Right. And they look at the stats and see, where are we? What level are we? Oh, not enough people are watching. We got to change something. We have to do, they're always chasing what they think is going to make more people, which is usually a bit of pandering. And you find it in movies, you find it in testing. They take it to a mall and people push buttons to say, that was funny, that wasn't funny. Well, do they know what's funnier than Jerry Seinfeld thinks is funny? I don't think so.
Yeah.
It was kind of panned by those groups early on.
Right.
And, there were a couple of people. I think I would give Lily Tartikoff a lot of credit. That was Brendan Tartikoff's wife. She was a fan. She liked Jerry and Jerry's show and thought he was funny. And at that very beginning is when Brendan Tartikoff was running the show at the Pilot River. And I think at home, she gave him the nudge, give it a shot, keep it on. So that was like one vote that made a big difference.
Hey, wives have influence, that I know. So Pat, then those are great points. And I think that happened to Seinfeld a little bit too in the later years. Like they rode the ratings wave, but like Matt said, there was so much formative stuff happening in year one to kind of get to that point. So when did you know? You mentioned you guys wrote an episode, Larry took it back and rewrote it. He seemed to do that a lot. But when did you know, like, how to write for these characters, and who were some of your favorite characters to write for? Like, how long did that take? Did Jerry? I mean, it doesn't sound like Larry and Jerry had like overarching meetings with themes and things like that, right? It seems like they had it in their head, but what did they kind of tell you about these characters?
Well, it was it was interesting. I kind of learned on the fly because we were in and it was all happening at once. But I can tell you, and I say this with affection, like when Jason came in initially, he was kind of playing a more nebbish Woody Allen type voice in the first few episodes, but he found his voice and George became his own thing. Right. And you know, you got to credit every one of those actors for bringing the characters. You know, we all knew that Julia was one of the guys, or Elaine was one of the guys, and Julia embodied that really well. She like knew how to shove people around and do things, but she did it in such an organic way that she, you know, look, we were all guys writing for a women's storyline. So until later when Carol Leifer and some of the other, you know, strong female voices came in, but she was always played out as one of the guys. And even their attempt, I can't remember the episode where they went to date and that kind of didn't take. It was kind of like sleeping with a buddy. You couldn't do it, you know, for Jerry and Elaine.
Oh, The Deal.
Yeah, The Deal. That was the amazingly written episode.
But what we did have fun with, and this is the stuff I really liked being around in those early episodes, when he broke up with the male friend, the male unbonding.
Yeah, the male unbonding.
Treating that like a real breakup between two people, and making Kevin Dunn was the actor, I think.
Yeah.
And he was great. He was great because he played it so, he kind of guilted Jerry into things. And, you know, it's just like, oh, still got to be this dude's friend. And, you know, we've all had somebody around that you have to have over for Thanksgiving, or if you don't, then I'm going to make you do it this year because that person doesn't have anybody to come, you know, and you don't know how to shed that person from your life. So that, you know, we could relate to some of these things that Jerry and Larry were pitching that felt a little unusual. And I guess that's when I really, anytime a little turn, you know, like lying and say that he worked at Vandelay Industries and that he had a different job, you know, it's like, oh, everybody knows what it's like to be caught in a lie, you know, but George was classic. And this was very much a Larry thing, was he would go down the rabbit hole to try to keep that lie alive.
Yeah, I mean, our Vandelay was first mentioned in season one in the stock.
So
tip. I mean,
2 or 3 or something. Yeah, the stock tip. Yeah.
I mean, season one has its moments. I mean, it sets the characters up. We're huge fans of season 2, season 3. I mean, 2 through 5 really are quintessential George. But you know, our favorite episode is the phone message where, you know, George
has to chase down.
Yeah. I mean, that's where we're more in that camp, and then the later years it kind of just got cartoonish and a little bit.
I think in the midsection they really found their voice. I think that season 1 was, well, first of all, it was a short season, right? It was called the Seinfeld Chronicles, and was it 4 episodes initially? It
4,
was, yeah. So it was really literally 4 independent stories just trying to figure out what it was. But I think that the actors and the guest stars, really the key to everything was the, you know, Larry David's chronicling of his life, all of those real things, the soup Nazi, the contest, those were all happening. Those were all basically reflections of things that were funny in Larry's life. And you see it, if you just follow his career all the way through Curb, you see that he's married, then he's divorced. And then, because he's got some kind of funhouse mirror on himself.
Right.
That, and George is Larry, and we all know that by now, but Jason Alexander was sort of a more likable version of that. He was sort of the more palatable version of the selfish guy. And when you see it in Curb, you just shake your head sometimes and you go, why is he taking a handicapped parking spot? Why is, but that's so Larry, is to create enough crisis to make it funny and so he did that in every episode. It's by the end, you see how selfish these four characters are, and nobody really wins. They don't ever really get the tickets or they win the prize. They always end up hoisted on their own petard.
Right.
So it's funny, you brought up being a prop comic before. And do you remember the episode Larry Charles wrote The Fire? And they had Ronnie K. I don't know if that was like an ode to
Played
you.
by Dom Herrera.
I don't think it was an ode to me, but boy, Larry Charles was there were so many great people that came in there.
Yeah.
You've probably talked to many of them along the way, but Alec Berg and Schaefer and Berg were a team that were like a big part of it. And Tom and Max were
Max Pros.
Yeah. These were great combos of people who began to really understand how to move this uphill and forward together with them. But they worked all the time. Anybody who doesn't think that Jerry and Larry were writing their asses off. And I think it got harder when Jerry was running at the end on his own.
Right.
And so forth. It's just a lot to do, to create a thing and to write a thing and to act a thing and then to check on the edits and to be sure it's consistent. And I mean, I admire him for getting out at the top of his game. And even though NBC was throwing more money his way and so forth, it was like of his time. And, he hasn't had any problem with comedians in cars drinking coffee and whatever, finding other interesting ways to entertain people.
So speaking of Jerry, I know he was on your podcast. I'm sure you mentioned you were coming on this Seinfeld podcast.
Yeah, of course. By the way, he has a list of questions for you guys.
Oh, anytime. So tell us a little bit about the podcast. I think like us, we formed this during the pandemic for something to do. It sounds like you did say a little bit about the podcast. I listened to the Jason Alexander one today. It was great.
Oh, yeah. Well, it's called Creativity and Captivity, and it's really not about COVID or pandemic, but it is about somebody holding the audience captive for an hour was essentially the premise. And I decided that I do a lot of creative consulting for other things, for people's screenplays, for theater pieces and all those sorts of things. And those conversations were kind of keeping me alive when things shut down, because all my touring productions, I was directing commercials, that all closed down. All kinds of stuff was like off the table.
Right.
And I realized even though I didn't have a venue, I still had a voice. And many of these people were friends that I could see whether they were interested in very specifically talking about the creative process, how and why they do what they do. So the first shot I took was to Pete Docter, he's the chief creative officer of Pixar. And he was in charge of Up and Inside Out and Soul. He was the writer and director on all of those. And he was like, yeah, let's do that. And it was great. I mean, I was like, oh, this isn't so hard. Let's give it a go. And he gave me an hour of his time and we did the first episode. We spend a little bit of time on the material because I really want the guest to bring some golden nuggets that if somebody is a screenwriter, if they're a director, if they're an actor, whatever their interest in being creative is, that every guest has some transferable information. So I've talked to illustrators and ventriloquists and aerial choreographers and all kinds. And that's part of the game too, is a different creative discipline. And I'm getting some amazing people and they're super cool about it. And we do it as an audio only podcast, but it's available on all wherever the kids are getting their podcasts out of the back of a van, you can get it there. Um, but I'll be talking to Susan Stroman in the next couple of weeks. She directed and choreographed Mel Brooks' The Producers on Broadway. Wow. And lots of other, winning things, all that great stuff you see at the beginning of the Tonys when they do those crazy Neil Patrick Harris dance sequences. Right. She does all of that. And I like to talk to people who aren't necessarily gigantically famous, but who are wildly creative, who are, this woman, Drea Weber, was the aerial choreographer for all of Pink's concert stuff and the stuff you see her doing at the Grammys, hanging over the crowd singing. And, somebody's job is to make that happen.
That's awesome, man. I mean, we feel the same way about this, just talking to people that are doing different things and being creative. You had your hands in a lot of different creative things. I mean, magic, stand-up comedy, the writing, the producing, the one-man shows. Where do you feel like, how would you, I don't want to say describe yourself, but what did you enjoy the most of all those things you've kind of done in your career? Or is it just, you just like to go on to the next thing and kind of just keep learning? Or is there one in particular you kind of hang your hat on?
Well, I did well in a few of them at different times. Like I felt like I was graduating to different forms.
Yeah.
No, but what's interesting is that's when it occurred to me that my most interest is in creativity. Just creative,
wherever
right.
It is. Right.
But I didn't know that, initially I was a kid magician and I was solving problems and figuring out how to do tricks. And then I was a sitcom, I was a stand-up comic and then a sitcom writer. They're all just puzzles to put together in some way. And ultimately what I was doing that I didn't know was I was a producer. Producer's always looking at the budget, figuring out what we can do, talking to the set designer, talking to the costumer, talking to, all those elements are just another puzzle. So ultimately, I'm a good producer because I'm always thinking about all the elements of it. And I'm pretty good at staying on budget, and I'm generally good at coming up with an original idea. And I didn't know that. Like when you're a kid, if you said, do you want to be a producer? You wouldn't even know what that is.
Right.
And nobody would pick it. Everybody wants to be a director or a star. That's the bottom line, is that they think that's where all the power is. And, you have to, being a director is specific. When you direct theater, it's one thing. And when you direct sitcoms or movies, it's another thing. In sitcom land, the director is almost, even the ones that were on for a long time, they're still beholden to the producer, to Larry or Jerry's opinion. Right. And the notes come from there down to you and then get dispersed. You're a mechanic that is managing the director of photography and the cameraman, and you being sure the story tells. Like, you have a lot of responsibilities, but it's not the sort of auteur thing that you would get in film if you're a director.
Right.
And in theater, what's funny is that the director disappears when opening night comes. The actor actually is the runaway stagecoach. At that point, every night they get to do whatever they want in their performance, hoping to keep it consistent. But the director closes down on a sitcom with the editor and it's finished and nobody can mess with it. But in theater, they just vanish into the night. And then the cast is in charge of it with notes from a production manager or producer or somebody along the way. But they're kind of different. Even the word producer, I found that when I would talk to the audience about what a producer is, there are so many versions of it that you kind of can't tell what. There's a line producer whose job is very much about the money. What does everything cost? How do I get it to work? And then you go over to Broadway, and most of those producers are just people who donate money to get it built. Like a guy could be a producer and all he did was write a check for $1 million and nothing else.
Right.
So, and then underneath it, I don't know how the audience, when they read the credits, there's a co-producer, an associate producer, there's all these things and they all do a slightly different thing.
Right.
Yeah. And they all reap the benefits from Seinfeld, a lot of them. Well, our producer just writes a check and that's it, Pat. But
yeah. And which one of you is the producer and which producer?
He's the one you don't see on screen right now, our producer.
Oh, yeah. That's the Tom Sawyer of this operation.
Right.
He's got you guys painting the fence.
It's funny you mentioned everyone wants to be the star, but just to close out and finish with Seinfeld, like I think that was the essence of Seinfeld. Jerry didn't have to be the star. He he kind of distributed it to his
egoless
cast and the guest stars. I'm assuming you felt that, right? Being part of that show.
No, he articulated it to me in a different way. And among other things, he knew he wasn't an actor. He knew that he was a stand-up comic playing the central character, and he equated himself to being more like Andy Griffith on the series. So the characters around Andy Griffith were kooky, and, Barney is Kramer, you know what I mean? Like,
right.
Let them breathe, let them do their thing. And he's the stable guy at the desk, sort of running the sheriff's office and all the nutty stuff, Gomer and Goober and people are coming in.
And that's why, sorry, go ahead.
No, but I'm saying to a credit to him that he knew he had an ensemble piece. He let people shine. He let guest stars shine. And I think on other series, sometimes when somebody gets to be the star of a show, they kind of commandeer all the jokes for themselves, because and sometimes it's their agent, sometimes it's somebody else who wants them to become a star out of it, and they don't care if the vehicle is good. But I think they always had the sense of this being a solid ensemble show.
Yeah, and Jerry remained the most consistent throughout. We always say that. I know Howard likes to bring that up too. I mean, even when the show got a little bit outlandish in seasons 8 and 9, because Jerry was that guy early on, he just stayed that guy. I mean, things got wackier around him and stuff, but Jerry was like the rock of the whole thing, kind of just holding it together as far as the characters went, as far as the show went. And it's a really good analogy that, things were circling around him and he was sort of holding everything together.
Yeah, which is great. But he also began to find he was a little more animated. He had ways of, his voice would do certain cadences. Some of that stuff was discovery. And part of it was that there was a atmosphere where they were bringing stuff to the party. The way Kramer would enter. I remember in the early episodes, that used to drive Larry David crazy. He really didn't like Michael Richards sliding in or hitting the door jam or making some weird thing. And
really?
as the warm up, he would say to me, tell the audience not to, laugh or clap. I go, I'm not telling them. You tell them, because it was almost like Jackie Gleason entering on The Honeymooners, where he would come walking on and spread his arms up and like, hey, and then the crowd would cheer. Look, that was Michael's invention. I think it's amazing. But for Larry, it was sort of like it was eating away story time.
Right.
And it was just, but that one, he couldn't beat that. That was one that the crowd loved it so much, he couldn't get rid of it. But when it came to the stand-up segments, that was Larry's doing, and rightfully so. He needed more story time. If he had 22 or 23 minutes of story and 2 or 3 minutes got stolen for stand-up bits, he was coming up, so it was like, hey, look, he's a stand-up comic. We get it. We don't have to show him doing his job. Cheers. You barely ever saw anybody mixing a drink on Cheers. Right. It was a bar, right?
Right. What was the stand-up there in the beginning, though? I wonder, because they were afraid they wouldn't be able to write enough because they were all new. They're just like, let's just.
I would say not
just for the story more. That was the pitch. It was.
My guess isn't that it was that they couldn't write enough. I think it was what often happens is the insurance policy of Jerry's a very good stand-up comic.
Right.
So we at least have that, right?
And it always tied in too, right?
I think that always happens. You saw on the Tonight Show, when Jay Leno was host full on, he was good at monologues. The monologue got a lot longer. It was sort of like, hey, let's go into Jay's wheelhouse, right? So right. I think that's kind of the nature of all people creating something new is hold on to an insurance policy of something that might get you through that mess.
Well, like I said in the beginning, not many people were there from the beginning. You were, Pat. Hats off. I mean, you've brought us a lot of joy. We love the new podcast. Before I let you go, who's Nebraska's favorite son? Is it Tom Osborne or Warren Buffett?
Oh, well, favorite son? That's a good question. At one time for Nebraska, it was Johnny Carson.
Right.
And
because you got the okay there with him.
I did get the okay, but I would say if you talk to people in the state, anybody sports related will tell you it's Tom Osborne, but Warren Buffett has lasted the test of time. And most of those people bought some Berkshire Hathaway stock when it was low, and Warren keeps riding it out. So I would say he's going to get more credit. I once did a thing with Warren, which I was hosting a fundraiser, and it was at the time when Who Wants to Be a Millionaire was sort of at its peak.
Yep.
And Regis was doing that, and they asked me for sort of a sketch premise, and I said, why don't we do Who Wants to Be a Jillionaire? And all the contestants already have to be billionaires. So we had Warren Buffett and this guy named Walter Scott, and these guys own major companies, and it was really funny because we were able to kind of reenact the show with these millionaires or billionaires as contestants. And then at the end, Warren won. And he's sort of notoriously tight. So I said, you won the $1 jillion. What are you going to do with it? And he said, well, that's a lot of money. So of course I'm going to give each of my kids $300 and I'm going to get a new suit or something.
Yeah.
But he was a good sport. Yeah.
Cool.
Pat,
Well,
this is
Pat,
great, man. Thank you so
Thanks
much.
so much for the time and the memories. We appreciate it.
Well, no, we appreciate you guys, your affection for the show and keeping the conversation going. Have you had Stephanie Kennedy on?
Yes,
Yeah.
we got Stephanie Kennedy on. Yeah.
Yeah, she's been doing a lot of cool posting on
Yep.
Facebook and other things, and
And
showing
Wayne,
pictures.
Wayne Kennan on too, the director of photography.
Oh yeah.
The behind the scenes stuff is really really interesting to us, and the writing.
Yeah. Well, it was a good family. Everybody was working together to make a cool thing under their guidance, and I think it really just was a really amazing trip to be on, even for whatever period of time anybody kind of joined in on it. It's in the rest of the world, it's like being in the space program, where people go, oh, I've been to the moon kind of thing, right? Like I don't generally throw the credit around, but if I go to a party in Austin, people go, oh, that guy wrote on Seinfeld. Like you could hear it from across the room, and somebody wants to tell a secret to somebody. So it is, it's a pretty good badge of honor to have on your
for sure, man. Original.
All right, boys. Well, good
Thanks
luck.
so much, Pat.
And I'll expect my residual checks to come just flowing in. Talk to your producer about how this breaks down.
Will do.
Thanks so much, Pat. Have a great night.
Have
man.
a good one, boys. Cheers.